How do we understand madness? From the start, it is a difficult question for reason to approach because madness is necessarily beyond all reason. But to establish a society governed by Enlightenment principles of rationality and order, what might be called the rule of reason, we have to define the limits of reason, and that means we must define insanity. If we are to understand ourselves as truly sane, then we must answer, what does it mean for someone to be insane? What is the cause of insanity? And what do we do with the insane person? How do we understand the nature of his affliction? Is it a physiological condition, the result of trauma, a moral failure, the result of sin? The way that we answer this question will inevitably have a profound effect on society, in the way that the insane are treated and how they fit into our society that claims to establish itself on reason. Michel Foucault's ambitious project is to chart a history of how these questions were answered, a history of how madness has been understood within the modern period of Western civilization. Foucault's book, titled in English Madness and Civilization, is titled in French A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason. Foucault begins at the end of the Middle Ages and takes us through the Renaissance, through the classical period of the 17th and 18th centuries, and then up to the current understanding. This work is adapted from Foucault's dissertation, and it is one of his most famous and influential books. It sent ripples through the Western world. Foucault analyzes multiple perspectives on madness in this work, and how these perspectives evolved, changed, overthrew one another, sometimes returned in new forms. By the very act of comparison, Foucault calls into question whether our own views on madness are, in fact, objective and rationally derived, the products of a dispassionate Enlightenment reason, as we might like to think of our views, or whether our views are just such a culturally determined artifact of the current era, reflective of the power dynamics, the material and social realities of our own time. This is part of the power of contrast. It's why Nietzsche used that same technique. Because the very act of comparing and considering past perspectives undermines the dogmatism of the current view. Past views, which are irreconcilable with ours, were held with the same kind of dogmatic fervor as we invest today into our own perspective. As such, Madness and Civilization calls into question the entire institution of the mental asylum and the premises which form its foundation. That the asylum is a place where medical professionals do their best to heal people with an affliction. These premises of our modern understanding, for Foucault, mask a series of moral assertions and serve to obfuscate the way in which the modern asylum is a recreation of the structures of paternal authority. The modern asylum attempts to make the insane patient internalize the power dynamic, rather than imposing it upon him in an explicit form. And thus, while our common sense view of history might lead us to believe that people in the past were a bunch of irrational moralists and religious zealots, whereas we have become enlightened because we now treat insanity as a mental disorder, Foucault would say that, in fact, earlier times did not always treat insanity as this type of moral failing, and that our own modern understanding of insanity does not come out of a dispassionate objectivity, but in fact out of the moralism of the 19th century, which is the era in which the asylum is born. Michel Foucault was born in 1926 to a middle-class family that was, culturally at least, French Catholic. In his youth, Foucault was an altar boy for a brief time, and he attended Catholic school and received a Jesuit education. He did not enjoy his time there, though he did excel in his studies. He described himself as a delinquent in his youth, and he described his father as a bully. He was a teenager during the Second World War and lived under the Nazi occupation. In 1945, he attended his secondary schooling at a prestigious university in Paris, where he studied under Hippolyte, the Hegelian philosopher. His other great interest besides philosophy was psychology. Foucault attended lectures on the subject and obtained his BA in psychology as well as a degree in psychopathology. Though he often performed exceptionally well in his academic efforts, he was a solitary student, and he spent most of his time reading rather than making friends. Foucault was gay at a time when, even in France, homosexuality was not socially acceptable relative to today's standards. He was also fascinated by images of medieval torture, the black paintings of Goya, scenes from the Napoleonic Wars, which he would display in his dorm room. That was another thing that was somewhat off-putting to his fellow students. He declared himself a disciple of the Marquis de Sade, the writer for whom the name sadism was coined, and he began to exhibit increasingly unhinged behaviors. In one incident, Foucault was discovered by one of the teachers lying on the floor of the classroom, shirtless, with evidence of self-harm. In another, he chased other students through the hallways with a dagger. Eventually, he was evaluated by a psychiatrist because of his increasing sadomasochistic and suicidal thoughts. The psychiatrist diagnosed Foucault's impulses to self-harm as a result of his mental and emotional distress surrounding his homosexuality and the fact that his sexual orientation was socially taboo. Foucault eventually studied under Althusser, who convinced him to join the Communist Party in the year 1950. But Foucault was never a committed Marxist. In fact, he rejected its central doctrines, which were premised on the reduction of individuals into class structures. Foucault's entire career, in fact, demonstrates a constant suspicion and criticism toward all sources of authority, particularly claims of ethical authority or philosophical categories and definitions that serve to enforce or reify a structure of authority. His lifelong project springs out of a refusal to be governed, and this led to Foucault's conciliatory position in his later years towards ostensibly rightist ideologies such as libertarianism. Because he recognized that even though such a worldview would differ from the orthodox Marxist conception of class struggle, at bottom it was driven by the same desire as that of the revolutionary proletarian, the same refusal to be governed. During his time in the Communist Party, Foucault was also shocked by the anti-gay bigotry he perceived within its ranks, and he hated the anti-Semitism that was displayed by the Soviet Union. He left the Communist Party in 1953, though he remained loyal to Althusser and continued to defend his value as a thinker. During his career, Foucault traveled all around Europe and to America. He discovered Nietzsche while on a trip to Italy with his boyfriend at the time, the composer Jean Barak. His first foray into Nietzsche's work were Nietzsche's 4 essays, The Untimely Meditations. Foucault called these a revelation. During this period of his life, he also visited Poland, Sweden, and taught for 3 years in Tunisia after its liberation from French rule. There have been allegations about Foucault during that time, but these are somewhat controversial, and the point of the episode is to talk about his work and not get bogged down in discussing controversies surrounding Foucault. Suffice to say, he was certainly an example of mad genius. Foucault exemplifies the fact that I repeatedly find to be validated, that all of our greatest artists and writers were usually, for lack of a better word, bad people. He was clearly tormented by his own psychological demons throughout his life, and sometimes his desire to push the social and moral boundaries resulted in shocking or scandalizing behavior. I suppose the question that's still debated today is exactly how far Foucault went beyond those boundaries in terms of his actual actions and behaviors in life, whether it went into the realm of criminality, which again, that's a question I'm just going to leave aside because it's not the topic of the episode. Foucault's ambitious academic career eventually took him to the United States, where he taught for a couple of years in Buffalo, and then he went back to Paris, where he joined the Collège de France. He became increasingly popular and influential in the United States, and he repeatedly returned to lecture to huge crowds. He was active in the San Francisco gay scene in the early 1980s, at a time when no one really understood the AIDS virus, and Foucault became one of its early victims. As a matter of fact, he didn't even really seem to believe the virus was real and refused to believe that he had it. After he was diagnosed with the illness, he was admitted to Paris's Hôpital de la Salpêtrière. This same institution, as we will see, was of central importance in Madness and Civilization, and as fate had it, Foucault would die there in the year 1984. Madness and Civilization was published in 1961. It was mainly written while Foucault was abroad in Sweden and Germany and Poland, but it draws on insights that Foucault gleaned while working in a psychiatric hospital in Paris, and from his studies of the history of how mental illness was understood. He chose this topic for his opus because of his own psychological problems. his suicidal thoughts and tendencies to self-harm and sadomasochism. The ranks of psychologists are always laced with those who have taken up the career in order to diagnose and confront their own illnesses. While it is important to keep in mind Foucault's motivations when reading the texts, I think this mainly applies to the value judgments that Foucault makes toward the end of the book, particularly his comments on de Sade. When considering what I would regard as the most important and insightful aspects of the work concerning the history of madness, and how the perspectives on madness changed from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance to the Classical period to the modern view, I find Foucault's writing to be incredibly rigorous and laser-focused on the evidence for his positions. So, obviously there's a motivation here, but Foucault backs up what he's saying. Madness and civilization is chock full of primary sources, and this is both to its benefit and, at times, to its detriment. In particular, the middle chapters. Frankly, they're a bit of a slog. These chapters are heavy with long quotations from antiquated medical texts. But while this doesn't make for easy reading for us, it's clear that Foucault has done his. His arguments here are based on a serious study of the perspectives of earlier times. Rather than simply dismissing those perspectives as scientifically worthless, which might be the common approach in modern thought, Foucault follows Nietzsche in an important way. He sees these perspectives as revelations about the psychology of the time. Foucault is psychologizing the psychologists, in other words. The implicit question that Madness and Civilization repeatedly asks is, what was going on in the head of those who defined insanity? Why did they see things the way that they did, and what does their perspective reveal to us about them, about the emotional and mental history of the age? The book begins with an examination of a dramatic change that took place in Europe at the end of the Middle Ages. A change so gradual that it wouldn't have been perceptible over one lifetime, but over centuries. At the end of the Middle Ages, leprosy began to disappear. As to why this happened, Foucault does not spend too much time on this question because it's only incidental to his point, but he suggests it may have something to do with the end of the Crusades and the fact that after the Ottoman conquest of Byzantium, Western Europe's economic contact with Central Asia was severely limited. In the past, these trade routes to the east were the primary vectors of disease into Western Europe. As far as the evidence stands now, while we still don't really have a definitive answer, Foucault is half right on this. Another major factor he doesn't really touch on is simply that the European immune system simply became better able to cope with the disease, especially after centuries of the Black Death. Perhaps most importantly, new practices of sanitation also played a role. But what began to happen is that in the 1500s and the 1600s, the authorities in Europe began to take note in the decline in the number of lepers. What had begun as a gradual change, suddenly they started to look around and say, where have all the lepers gone? And by the early to mid 1600s, the disease had mostly disappeared from the Western world. True enough, people continued to contract leprosy, and it still exists to this very day, but as a percentage of the population, these were tiny numbers compared to the number of lepers before. And just to give you a sense of that decline, we can look at the number of lazar houses that existed during the Middle Ages. A lazar house was another name for a leprosarium. They were called lazar houses after Lazarus from the Bible, and they were located on the outskirts of town so that the lepers could be kept away from the general population. This is because, while leprosy is not an extremely contagious disease, you can catch it from continued close contact with someone who's infected. Obviously, they didn't have a sophisticated germ theory in the Middle Ages, but they were able to figure out that it spread in conditions where lepers were kept in close quarters with a bunch of other people. So the solution was obviously to expel them from the rest of society, to keep the disease contained. In the days of the Greeks and the Romans, they would establish leper colonies offshore on islands. By the time of medieval Europe, they had the lazar house. In the High Middle Ages, there were almost 20,000 lazar houses throughout Europe, but over the centuries that number declined until the 1500s and 1600s, when the heads of state in Europe began to take note that most of the existing leper houses had only a handful of patients. All of the political authorities across Europe during this time began to reallocate the land and the resources previously put into the lazar houses into other things. Foucault writes of the Lazare houses that, quote, "From the 15th century on, all were emptied. In the next century, Saint Germain became a reformatory for young criminals," end quote. Henri IV in 1606 ordered the accounts of the leprosariums revised to reallocate any extra funds that were still going towards these mostly empty Lazare houses to, quote, "the sustenance of poor noblemen and crippled soldiers," end quote. In England, quote, "the Lazare House of St. Bartholomew, established in 1078, had been one of the most important in England. Under Elizabeth, it cared for only 2 patients. It was finally closed in 1627. End quote. By the time of the 18th century, all of the Lazare houses were either gone or had been repurposed in this way to become refuges for indigents or workhouses for criminals and madmen. The reason why Foucault begins with the end of the leper house is because that great repurposing of the leprosariums at the edge of town would become definitive of the way in which the classical age handled madness. Not only was the Lazare house the physical building that the madmen would eventually be moved into, but there is a connection in the way that leprosy was perceived as a disease by Christian Europe in the Middle Ages and the way they perceived madness. While lepers were obviously excluded from society, over the centuries there had been a considerable push from the Church to change the common view of leprosy, from the one that had obtained during classical antiquity. Jesus had ministered to the lepers, he had shown kindness to them, and the Church therefore rebranded leprosy as a kind of holy disease. The Church would promote the view that the leper was suffering an affliction in this mortal coil, which would ultimately allow them to pay penitence for their sins in the here and now, and so this would benefit them in the afterlife. The affliction was not a moral condemnation on the individual, but actually a kind of mercy from God. It allows the sinner to work off their sins now, so that they could perhaps advance through purgatory more quickly. The leper is thus expelled from the community, but not, as a kind of shameful thing. The Lazare house is the Church's commitment to the leper to nevertheless take care of them, to provide food and shelter and hospitality for such people. And, this may be an obvious point, but it's worth looking at the etymology. Where do we get the word hospital? It comes from hospitality. The original meaning of hospital was not a place where doctors cured the sick. Taking care of the infirm would certainly be included, but the origin of the name is a place where one finds hospitality, where one finds refuge. This is the formula of exclusion, as Foucault calls it, that will repeat itself in new forms during the classical age. But before this change took place, we have to consider that transitional period between the Middle Ages and modernity, which is known as the Renaissance. And according to Foucault, they had a very different perception of madness than the perception that would obtain in later centuries. In some sense, the Renaissance view of madness is peculiar to the age, but we can also see it as the last expression of an older view of insanity, perhaps even a refinement or a sublation upon that view, before the madman would take the place of the leper in European society. At the end of the Middle Ages, the motif that dominated the artistic zeitgeist was death, the skull, the dance macabre. In the 1400s, for example, a mural of the dance macabre was painted at the Cemetery of the Innocents, which was the largest cemetery in Paris. This theme was apropos to a Europe that had endured by this time a century of the Black Death and a catastrophic death toll in both civil and international warfare. As I've argued in another episode, that leitmotif of death, the poetic form of the lament and the litany, the imagery of the grim reaper that is born during this era, that is definitive of the time, because of the widespread sense that they had at the end of the Middle Ages that civilization as we know it is dying all around us. Perhaps it is even the end times. That is the way they were thinking. But as Europe begins to reintegrate once again, and the plague begins to recede, and there is this infusion of texts from the ancient world, new developments in science and engineering and art, the dominant cultural motif also changes. It is no longer the Grim Reaper. It is instead the figure of the fool. And Foucault brings up one very popular image from this time, the Nevenschrift, or Stultifera Nevis, the ship of fools. This image appears in popular fiction at the time, and it may not actually refer to a real story or a real historical phenomenon, Foucault admits. But what Foucault sees as the nugget of truth in this metaphor is the fact that madmen were often dealt with by simply expelling them. That is how you would deal with a madman during this time. When a person was deemed insane, it was often because they were causing some sort of public disturbance. For example, in Frankfurt in 1399, the seamen were asked to expel a madman who was walking naked in the streets. And what would often happen is that the madmen were shuffled from town to town, from port to port in this way. They would be taken to some new place where nobody knew them, and then they eventually irritated and disturbed the locals in this new town, and the locals would ask the next ship that came in, please take this madman somewhere else, and then they'd be taken to a third location, and on and on. So while there may not have been a literal ship full of fools, Foucault writes that basically this was a real sort of social solution to the problem of madness, a perpetual kind of expulsion of the madman. As Foucault writes, quote, "Madmen then led an easy, wandering existence," end quote. And while those madmen who committed criminal offenses were treated in the same manner as other criminals, and the madmen who didn't commit criminal offenses were still condemned to be in this continuous state of wandering, or of vagabondage, we might call it. The notion of incarcerating them, either to correct the errors of their misperception of the world, or to cure them of a mental illness, neither of these notions existed yet. The medieval conception of madness is that insanity, like pox or leprosy, was an affliction of the soul. This is a sin-cursed world, and just as our flesh can be afflicted, so can the mind. There's no need to morally condemn the madman or to treat him as a patient. In Foucault's understanding, madness in the old Christian worldview is, quote, "the lowest point of humanity to which God submitted his incarnation," thereby showing that there was nothing inhuman in man that could not be redeemed and saved, end quote. In other words, Christ himself is called mad. He has his moment of great sort of existential anxiety and terror and confusion on the cross. There was said to be a certain madness of the cross, an irrational madness of sacrifice. This, in Foucault's mind, is a kind of respect for madness. It's not a medical condition, it is the lower limit of human truth. As mentioned, these themes carry on into the Renaissance, but the major change or the sublation that occurs in the Renaissance is what Foucault describes as the recognition that folly is an inextricable part of human reasoning, particularly that the human pursuit of knowledge or grandeur naturally contains within it an element of foolishness, or, taken to the extreme, madness. We're all familiar with stories like that, right? Of the person who is so obsessed or so ambitious that it almost takes the form of madness. We might think of somebody like Howard Hughes, somebody who's driven mad by this extreme obsession and ambition. Or maybe perhaps the ways in which he's obsessed over the things that make him rich and an incredible inventor are also the things that make him mentally ill. And Foucault lists off many of the major literary figures that appeared during this time of transition. We might think of Cervantes and his farcical knight, Don Quixote. We might think of King Lear, wandering the heath with his fool, who speaks honestly to Lear. He's the only person who speaks honestly to Lear. He reveals to Lear that he, in fact, is himself a fool for having dispossessed the only daughter who loved him, and having entrusted his power to ambitious bullies. And there is, of course, the Narrenschrift story itself, the image of the ship of fools. And Foucault also makes reference to the paintings of Bosch, depicting sort of strangely animal-human hybrids as symbols of madness. And so the Renaissance turn in the understanding of madness develops the medieval perspective on the human condition that sees mankind as supported by God alone, and sees an unrestrained drive for knowledge as a kind of hubris, as a prideful flirtation with insanity. Foucault writes, quote, "Erasmus in his Dance of Fools reserves a large place for scholars. After the grammarians, the poets, the rhetoricians and writers, come the jurists, and after them the, quote, philosophers respectable in beard and mantle," end quote. Finally, the numberless troops of the theologians. But if knowledge is so important in madness, it is not because the latter can control the secrets of knowledge, On the contrary, madness is the punishment of a disorderly and useless science. If madness is the truth of knowledge, it is because knowledge is absurd, and instead of addressing itself to the great book of experience, loses its way in the dust of books and in idle debate. Learning becomes madness through the very excess of false learning." End quote. Madness, or folly, to use the language of the time, occurs at the point where knowledge becomes an ignorant presumption. Foucault argues that madness is the comic punishment of the ignorant presumption to knowledge. Where the Renaissance arguably breaks with the perspective of the Middle Ages is that in this celebration of madness, this explosion of the imagery of the fool and the madman and so on, there is the realization, quote, "There is no madness but that which is in every man, since it is man who constitutes madness in the attachment he bars for himself and by the illusions he entertains." End quote. Further down, Foucault continues, quote, "Madness deals not so much with truth and the world as with man and whatever truth about himself he is able to perceive." End quote. Madness in the Renaissance thus occupies, in some sense, the same role as death did at the end of the Middle Ages. Madness is an end point. Foucault argues that Shakespeare and Cervantes do not present a vision of madness in which one's sanity can ever be restored to truth or reason. There is a tragic reality to madness that characterizes the cultural understanding during the Renaissance. Mad, quote-unquote, is the way we would describe a character in a Shakespearean tragedy who is driven to follow a given passion to an insane degree, leading to their own destruction. It seems to always end that way. That's the madness of Ophelia or Lear. Madness is a sort of extremity in this way, and its endpoint is just as reversible as that of death. And so madness is of the nature of man. It is a tragic end that could happen to any one of us. It's part of the human condition in the same way that death is part of the human condition. And this is why madness can be given the sense of farce or the sense of dramatic tragedy. It is why the madman can be allowed to roam free even if he is in a constant state of expulsion. Because his madness is not something that you cure, in the same way that death is not something that you cure. And yet, this is soon to change. Foucault writes, quote, "But very soon, madness leaves these ultimate regions where Cervantes and Shakespeare had situated it. And in the literature of the early 17th century, it occupies, by preference, a median place. It thus constitutes the not more than the denouement, the peripety rather than the final release." End quote. So madness is to become not a final and ultimate reality, but a knot to be untangled. Denouement, that term means, quite literally, deknotment, you could say. The tangled threads of a narrative are finally untangled in the denouement. It's another word for a conclusion. So Foucault is saying madness ceases to be a conclusion. It is in a median place rather than a ultimate place. It's no longer considered in its tragic reality. With this turn, quote, "The classical experience of madness is born." End quote. Further down, he continues, quote, "Scarcely a century after the career of the mad ships, we note the appearance of the theme of the, quote, hospital of madmen, the madhouse." End quote. So why does this change occur? Why does the West begin this process of incarcerating the madmen rather than letting them wander freely? For Foucault, the story is inseparable from the social, economic, and political realities that characterize the beginning of the classical period. The 17th century was a time of economic revival, but this was disrupted by the outbreak of the 30 Years' War. During this time, the number of beggars and unemployed swelled greatly. Foucault writes, quote, "This was the period of uprisings in Paris, 1621, in Lyon, 1652, in Rouen, 1639. At the same time, the world of labor was disorganized by the appearance of new economic structures. As the large manufactories developed, the guilds lost their powers and their rights. The general regulations prohibited all assemblies of workers, all leagues, all associations. In many professions, however, the guilds were reconstituted. They were prosecuted, but it seems the parlements showed a certain apathy. The Parlement of Normandy disclaimed all competence to judge the rioters of Rouen. This is doubtless why the church intervened and accused the workers' secret gatherings of sorcery. A decree of the Sorbonne in 1655 proclaimed guilty of sacrilege and mortal sin all those found in such bad company." End quote. Foucault draws attention to several dynamics that are contextual to this particular time in history. For one, in France, the monarchy centralized its power as a consequence of the Fronde in the mid-17th century. Further, the Church was engaged in a project to reassert its own authority in the face of the Reformation. The decree of the Sorbonne is issued 2 years after the Fronde. Church and state at this time therefore existed in a curious relationship of competition and cooperation. Both recognized that they needed the other, but jockeyed over who would wield the greater cultural and political power. For the Church to call organized labor the den of sorcery would be for it to take the reins over the social conditions when the parlements were unwilling to do so. But the Church is only able to assert this power because the act of crushing organized labor also benefits the power of the state. And so the Church gets to assert itself in some perceived way, and the state tolerates this because it helps the state subjugate a threat to its power. The intersection of the interests of church and state most powerfully align in their mutual opposition to that old evil, idleness. Foucault notes that at the time when Henri IV laid siege to Paris, the city had 100,000 residents, 30,000 of which were beggars. So a third of the population. The authorities did not regard the beggars with compassion, but saw them essentially as idlers. In fact, they passed laws against begging, whether in public or in private. In 1532, the Parlement of Paris arrested beggars. They chained them in pairs and forced them to work in the city's sewers. In 1606, a decree ordered that the beggars of Paris be whipped and branded in the public square and then banished from the city. Archers were posted to prevent any of them from returning. Church and state hated idleness because, as the saying goes, idle hands are the devil's playground. What are they going to do? When a large proportion of the populace who will not or cannot work, they have a lot of free time, and what are they going to do? They're going to agitate politically, because these people are poor and destitute for the most part, and they'll largely be hostile to the system. Or from the perspective of the church, they're going to engage in sin and vice. So idleness is a threat to the social fabric, the moral and political order of the time. Idleness strikes against the whole moral order of the Christian worldview. The position of the state is therefore that the poor have to be put to work so that they aren't out there rioting in the streets, and the position of the church, meanwhile, is that the poor need to be made or compelled to work for moral reasons, for their own good. Foucault elaborates on the religious dimension of this, and I'm going to quote in abridged form from a longer section because I think it's a very powerful section for us to understand the church's frame of mind and how they approach this problem. Quote, "Labor's effectiveness was acknowledged because it was based on an ethical transcendence. Since the fall, man had accepted labor as a penance and for its power to work redemption. It was not a law of nature which forced man to work, but the effect of a curse. The obligation to work was not linked to any confidence in nature. The theme was constant among Catholic thinkers as among Protestants that labor does not bear its own fruits. Here is Calvin's admonition, quote, "Nor do we believe, according as men will be vigilant and skillful, according as they will have done their duty well, that they can make their land fertile. It is the benediction of God which governs all things." End quote. This precarious labor to which nature is never obliged to respond, save by the special will of God, is nonetheless obligatory in all strictness, not on the level of natural syntheses, but on the level of moral syntheses. The poor man who, without consenting to torment the land, waits until God comes to his aid, since he has promised to feed the birds of the sky, would be disobeying the great law of Scripture. Quote, "Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God." End quote. Does not reluctance to work mean trying beyond measure the power of God, as Calvin says? If it is true that labor is not inscribed among the laws of nature, it is enveloped in the order of the fallen world. This is why idleness is rebellion, the worst form of all, in a sense. It waits for nature to be generous, as in the innocence of Eden, and seeks to constrain a goodness to which man cannot lay claim since Adam. End quote. So, in other words, this is a reinterpretation of the meaning of certain passages in the Gospels, such as when Jesus says, "Consider the lilies of the field, how they toil not." God takes care of all the things on the earth. Will he not take care of you, his children? Therefore take no thought for the morrow, so on and so forth. That message is all well and good, but the position here articulated by Calvin, that Foucault claims was also true of the counter-Reformation era Catholic Church, is that taking no thought for the morrow does not mean that you don't have to work. Remember, work is part of the curse, since the time of the fall. By the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread. To say, I'm not going to work, I'll rely on the miraculous power of God, is to test the Lord. God will provide for you if and when he pleases, not when you please. So idleness is a form of rebellion, and in fact the worst form because it denies the fallen state of man. And we see whenever these Christian movements arise, these heretical movements like the atomists or the neo-atomists that try to recapture the innocence of man before the fall, they are hated by the church. The very act of trying to reclaim that original innocence is a rebellion against God. And so the fundamental truth in the Christian doctrine is that man is not innocent. Man is guilty. To be idle would be to deny that guilt by refusing to accept the punishment. That is the meaning of work. It has nothing to do with the conception of work that would be articulated by Smith and others, that work is a great thing because it produces the wealth of nations. Almost all of the arguments we employ about the value of hard work today have nothing to do with this medieval perspective. So why are we discussing these economic factors and the fact that Christian Europe in the 1600s is faced with how to deal with this problem of beggars? Why is it relevant to madness? Well, that is the beginning of the hospital. The Hôpital Général is founded by royal decree in 1656. Practically speaking, it is a reorganization because other such institutions existed, but the Hôpital Général is remarkable in that it's empowered to take in people of both sexes, of all ages, able-bodied or invalid, sick or convalescent, curable or incurable, and to lodge and feed them. It was vested with extreme legal power to employ, quote, stakes, irons, prisons, and dungeons in the said Hôpital Général, end quote, and that their decisions, quote, will be executed according to their form and tenor, notwithstanding opposition or whatsoever appeal made or to be made, end quote. So the hospital has the power to punish and incarcerate, and there's no right of appeal. Who is the Hôpital Général made to inter? Indigents, beggars, in short, all idle people, and among their numbers are included many people who are mad, the kind of people whose mental ailments make them unable to work, unable to contribute anything to society. And what is the Hôpital Général's policy? Quote, all the poor who are capable of working must, upon work days, do what is necessary to avoid idleness, which is the mother of all evils, as well as to accustom them to honest toil and also to earning some part of their sustenance, end quote. Now, obviously, the main location at Salpêtrière is not the only one. These hospitals are erected all over France. As part of this new carceral order, the madman's easy wandering existence pretty much comes to an end. He is compelled to enter the hospital, along with all the other economically useless people. This did not just occur in France. Quote, in German-speaking countries, it was marked by the creation of houses of correction, the Zuchthausen, end quote. In England, these developments happened, in fact, even earlier, with the creation of houses of correction in 1575, with the stated purpose being, quote, the punishment of vagabonds and the relief of the poor, end quote. And very soon, these carceral houses of work begin to fill to the point where 1 in 100 Parisians is interred in the Hôpital Général. And I think what is so interesting about what Foucault is drawing our attention to here is something that may at first seem like a curious contradiction, that these houses at this time are paradoxically both a place of punishment and relief. They are both incarceration and refuge. How could that be? Well, such a description might cause us to reflect on our own conception of the mental hospital. For one, it's a place of involuntary incarceration, but also a place of treatment, a place where the insane person is made better. Yes, for their own sake, for their own health, but also, the criminally insane have to achieve sanity for the purpose of admitting and accepting their guilt, so there's a punitive element there. The common purpose that unites both relief and punishment is the notion that the indigent person is being corrected. By placing them into a workhouse where they are disciplined by being made to work, you're correcting the error of their idleness. This, from the moral perspective of the time, is a good and charitable deed. Foucault writes, quote, "In several years, an entire network had spread across Europe. John Howard, at the end of the 18th century, undertook to investigate it in England, Holland, Germany, France, Italy, Spain. He made pilgrimages to all the chief centers of confinement, hospitals, prisons, jails. And his philanthropy was outraged by the fact that the same walls could contain those condemned by common law, young men who disturbed their family's peace or who squandered their goods, people without profession, and the insane. Proof that even at this period a certain meaning had been lost. That which so hastily, so spontaneously summoned into being all over Europe, the category of classical order, we call confinement." End quote. This is another important point, that what we call confinement is not just an idea that comes out of the ether. It's not just an obvious reality. There was a period in our civilization before we practiced confinement. During the Middle Ages, when they caught a criminal, his punishment was not usually to be incarcerated. Usually the punishment was corporal, and usually it was carried out more or less immediately. They might have had a cell to hold you in while you awaited judgment, but the incarceration wasn't your punishment. So, not even criminals were dealt with this way. I mean, we would consider it to be more barbaric by modern standards, but it's more likely as a thief, you're just going to have your hands cut off. You're not going to be put into a cell. In the modern day, we treat the notion that bad people ought to be confined as sort of a matter of course. But relative to human history, this is a fairly new idea. And Foucault is pointing out, this idea comes out of a certain time and place. The classical order of the 17th century is what produces the logic of confinement. Quote, "Before having the medical meaning we give to it, or that at least we like to suppose it has, confinement was required by something quite different from any concern with curing the sick. What made it necessary was an imperative of labor." End quote. Even the Hôpital Général, which was not founded with the intention to give work to idle men, but simply to contain all the beggars and the indigents as a way of maintaining social order, even here they adopted the same regime. Foucault writes, quote, "Throughout Europe, confinement had the same meaning, at least if we consider its origin. It constituted one of the answers the 17th century gave to an economic crisis that affected the entire Western world. Reduction of wages, unemployment, scarcity of coin. The coincidence of these phenomena probably being due to a crisis in the Spanish economy. Even England, of all the countries of Western Europe the least dependent on the system, had to solve the same problems." End quote. There was a kind of cycle with how the workhouses were used. Every time an economic crisis occurred, the unemployed and the vagabonds and the idle would be herded into these houses. But when the economy would then improve, the governments would then have the thought of attempting to produce goods with real economic value out of these workhouses. And maybe even these goods could serve as a kind of price control by setting the baseline cost of a given product. The residents of these houses of work, therefore, labored as blacksmiths, as millers, as weavers. Every workhouse in Germany had its own specialty. Quote, "The alternation is clear. Cheap manpower in the periods of full employment and high salaries, and in periods of unemployment, reabsorption of the idle and social protection against agitation and uprisings." End quote. We see this example in the houses of correction in England. In the early 1600s, their mills and weaving shops existed to occupy the residents there. When the economic situation improved in 1651, however, these houses of correction were run with work as the main focus, with the goal of producing goods as cheaply as possible. And yet, these workhouses never managed to really change the underlying economic situation, Foucault argues. He cites Daniel Defoe, who argued that, quote, "By the effect of the too easy competition of the workhouses, poverty was created in one area on the pretext of suppressing it in another." End quote. The houses of correction were in fact so dysfunctional in an economic sense that at many times the pensioners there could not earn enough to even pay for their own lodge and board. And sometimes they would be put into prison just so that they could be given free bread. So if this wasn't actually an economic solution, why did confinement in the workhouse persist during the classical period? Quote, What appears to us today as a clumsy dialectic of production and prices then possessed its real meaning as a certain ethical consciousness of labor, in which the difficulties of the economic mechanisms lost their urgency in favor of an affirmation of value. In this first phase of the industrial world, labor did not seem linked to the problems it was to provoke. It was regarded, on the contrary, as a general solution, a panacea, a remedy to all forms of poverty." End quote. And so Foucault goes on to argue that ultimately, economics is subordinated to a moral consideration. The real function of the Hôpital is to enforce a moral order. Idleness is associated with vice, libertinage, and social agitation. So the Hôpital is empowered to make war on idleness. It is a moral institution, empowered to use incarceration without the right of appeal in order to enforce a moral end. Quote, "Confinement represents, in the form of an authoritarian model, the myth of social happiness, a police whose order will be entirely transparent to the principles of religion, and a religion whose requirements will be satisfied without restrictions by the regulations of the police." End quote. So at this point, madness is being treated effectively as just another form of idleness. Rather, it's one of those things that leads the individual to become separated from the social fabric. So how did they come to experience madness in the classical period as a result of these developments? Well, Foucault argues they come to associate madness with unreason. Madness is a departure from the truth of reality. It is becoming absorbed into one's own fixed idea. In other words, madness is in error. This is a reversal from the Renaissance view that saw madness as the limit and ultimate end of the pursuit of knowledge. Madness within that view is the end of reason. It is the vain folly of mankind that we pursue reason nevertheless. We are all fools because we give in to the folly of believing in the supremacy of our intellect. The classical view turns away from this. This is characteristic of that age. It can be tied to the cultural developments associated with the dawning Enlightenment. This is the age of reason, after all. And accordingly, the cultural understanding is a kind of celebration of reason. They don't see madness as part of reason or as the limit of reason. Madness instead is the absence of reason. Foucault makes a brilliant point here about something that the age of reason perceives about madness, but arguably it is also an aspect of madness that I would say Foucault seems to think has almost a sense to it. Madness necessarily involves reasoning. It isn't purely in false sensations or in a runaway imagination. It's not because people imagine false things that we call them mad. Madness, rather, has a kind of syllogistic form to it, or we might say paralogistic form, a false syllogism. Insane beliefs are if-then statements, and such statements become insane precisely at the point where they motivate actions. So madness is a false syllogism from which one's actions follow. Foucault writes, quote, "It is true that in the dream the imagination forges impossible things and miracles. Madness occurs when the images, which are so close to the dream, receive the affirmation or negation that constitutes errors." Encyclopédia produced its famous definition of madness, to depart from reason, quote, "with confidence and in the firm conviction that one is following it." That, it seems to me, is what is being called mad, end quote. So, when we're dreaming, we're not going mad, because while we're dreaming, reason doesn't play much of a role usually. Strange things happen, and usually you don't even notice that they're strange in the logic of the dream. But madness would be if you affirmed the irrational images and happenings of your dreams as real, and then acted accordingly while in waking life. The excellent example that Foucault uses is this. It is not insanity to imagine that you are made of glass. But if you then affirm that imagined reality, such that you believe that the slightest fracture of your skin would shatter your whole body, and then if you act in accordance with that error, then we call you insane. So madness is the if-then statement, the syllogism. If I am made of glass, then if I'm fractured, I will shatter. That is madness. As Sauvage says, madness is characterized by, quote, "this constant error of the soul manifest in the imagination, in its judgments and in its desires," end quote. So it's not only mad beliefs or sensations or imaginations, but the error of undertaking action in accord with those and persisted in. That is what makes you mad. And if madness is such an error, then it can be reconceived as not being this tragic and ultimate fate, because in the view of this age, an error can be corrected. Quote, beginning with the 17th century, unreason in the most general sense no longer had much instructive value. That perilous reversibility of reason which was still so close for the Renaissance was to be forgotten, and its scandals were to disappear. The great theme of the madness of the cross, which belonged so intimately to the Christian experience of the Renaissance, began to disappear in the 17th century, despite Jansenism and Pascal. It was no longer a matter of requiring human reason to abandon its pride and its certainties in order to lose itself in the great unreason of sacrifice. End quote. Further down, Foucault continues, quote, Christian unreason was relegated by Christians themselves into the margins of a reason that had become identical with the wisdom of God incarnate. After Port Royal, men would have to wait 2 centuries until Dostoevsky and Nietzsche for Christ to regain the glory of his madness, for scandal to recover its power as revelation, for unreason to cease being merely the public shame of reason. End quote. And so during the classical age, madness comes to be seen as something which is shameful, embarrassing. It was not uncommon that the reason somebody would be given to the hospital to be interred was that their mad behavior shamed their family. Foucault also brings up an incident in which a priest had to be confined because of his insanity, and the church reasoned that the madness of a man of God had to be hidden away from the public so that it did not dishonor the church. What is the real nature of this shame? There has always been an association between madness and the animal in man. We might think of the paintings of Bosch that we mentioned earlier. Much of Chapter 4 of Madness and Civilization involves an examination of madness as associated with the passions. This is another long-standing correlation in the human mind, that madness is a kind of heightened passion, a passion raised to a fixed, inflexible idea. In Plato's Ion, emotion is discussed in the same way. Passion, as they call it. It's a form of mimetic madness. We are undoubtedly creatures with drives and passions. We are undoubtedly animals, but Aristotle called man the rational animal. And there's a sense in which madness comes to be seen in the age of reason as the error of abandoning or neglecting one's rationality and letting the animal in man take over. Foucault describes how, accordingly, the insane during this period were often kept in conditions reminiscent of the way animals were kept. In cages, on floors with straw bedding, chained to the wall, so on and so forth. This inhuman indifference to the mad, Foucault says, quote, is rooted in the old fears which since antiquity have given the animal world its familiar strangeness, its menacing marvels, its entire weight of dumb anxiety, end quote. And thus Foucault goes on to argue, quote, in the classical period, the madman was not a sick man. Animality, in fact, protected the lunatic from whatever might be fragile, precarious, or sick in man. The animal solidity of madness, and the density it borrows from the blind world of beasts, inured the madman to hunger, heat, cold, and pain. It was common knowledge until the end of the 18th century that the insane could support the miseries of existence indefinitely. End quote. So, the classical age essentially sees these people as those who have fled from the demands of their rationality, thrown themselves into an animal existence. Madness becomes conceived as akin to a sort of defense mechanism from the fragility of being human. As Samuel Johnson says, quote, he who makes himself a beast gets rid of the pain of being a man, end quote. And that's more or less what they thought was going on here. These are stubborn souls who are persisting in their errors of thinking. Accordingly, Foucault writes, quote, madness was less than ever linked to medicine. Unchained animality could only be mastered by discipline and brutalizing. The theme of the animal madman was effectively realized in the 18th century in occasional attempts to impose a certain pedagogy on the insane. Pinel cites the case of a, quote, very famous monastic establishment in one of the southern regions of France, where a violent madman would be given a, quote, precise order to change if he refused to go to bed or to eat. He was warned, quote, that obstinacy in his deviations would be punished on the next day with 10 strokes of the bullwhip. If, on the contrary, he was submissive and docile, he was allowed to, quote, take his meals in the refectory, next to the disciplinarian, but at the least transgression, he was instantly admonished by, quote, a heavy blow of a rod across the fingers, end quote. Foucault also brings up the example of a Scottish farmer who claimed to have found a perfect, foolproof cure for insanity. Quote, his method consisted in forcing the insane to perform the most difficult tasks of farming, in using them as beasts of burden, as servants, in reducing them to an ultimate obedience with a barrage of blows at the least act of revolt, end quote. Foucault then devotes considerable time in the middle chapters to discussing archaic medical theories concerning the human body, based on the notion that comes to us from Galenic medicine of animal spirits. There are 3 kinds of animal spirits. I'm going to quote here from a description I found in the Cambridge University Press website. Quote, 3 systems of tubular vessels, the veins, the arteries, and the nerves, were understood as containing, respectively, blood, vital spirit, pneuma zooticon, absorbed from the atmosphere, and psychic spirit, pneuma psychicon. The last, known in Latin as spiritus animalis, was thought to be produced in the brain, by filtration or distillation from vital spirit and then distributed throughout the body by the nerves, end quote. This was central to the medical theory of Galen, whose ideas shaped the medieval understanding of physiology. It was also central to Descartes, with whom the Age of Enlightenment begins. So why is this important to Foucault? Well, as Foucault points out, madness has always been understood as an affliction of both body and soul. Body and soul intersect in the experience of madness. It is not just false sensation, but false reasoning. It springs just as much from error of the mind as from disharmony within these bodily humors. And as such, many of the treatments for common mental disorders involved a cure based on the understanding of the human body as consisting of these animal spirits. This could be remarkably straightforward. For example, the notion that someone having a manic episode should simply be plunged unexpectedly into frigid water. This is based on the idea that their inner spirits are excessively inflamed and that they simply need to be cooled down. And one of the interesting things Foucault notes here is that sometimes this worked, which is very strange because it doesn't accord with our own ideas of how madness is caused or how it's cured. And Foucault will often note in passing that various cures for madness over the years, based on archaic understandings, they're never universally effective, but they're almost always sometimes effective. Which is also the case today, isn't it? We can't perfectly cure madness, but sometimes we can. We might consider another example of this Galenic medical understanding that Foucault quotes from in one of these old texts, that hysteria more often strikes women than men because, quote, beyond what we may call the exterior man, who is composed of parts which are visible to the senses, there is an interior man, formed of a system of animal spirits, a man who can be seen only with the eyes of the mind. This latter man, closely conjoined and so to speak united with the corporeal constitution, is more or less deranged from his state to the degree that the principles which form the machine have a natural firmness. That is why this disease attacks women more than men, because they have a more delicate, less firm constitution, because they lead a softer life, and because they are accustomed to the luxuries and commodities of life, and not to suffering. End quote. Foucault's illuminating comment on this is as follows, quote, this spatial density yields one of its meanings. It is also a moral density. The resistance of the organs to the disordered penetration of the spirits is perhaps one and the same thing as that strength of the soul which keeps the thoughts and the desires in order. End quote. So I'm not going to go into much more detail about ancient medical theories than we've already done, but I just wanted to zero in on this point because it's a very important point about how the Age of Reason developed their view of madness. Their view of mental illness could be seen as akin to, say, antiquated views on post-traumatic stress disorder, the way that, it was originally called, I think, shell shock back in the days of World War I. But if you go back to the way they talked about PTSD in soldiers during the time of the American Civil War, what did they call it? They called it cowardice. Right? So essentially, it's not a mental illness, it's a kind of weakness. Or at least it's not a mental illness in the way we would think about it. If there is a disorder in the animal spirits within you, that's because you don't have a solid constitution. having a dissolute constitution could have the effect of causing a physical ailment, or it could be that you become too weak to resist the madness of your passions. And so therefore we could put it this way. All animals have passions, all animals are ruled by impulses, but man, the rational animal, has a faculty that specifically exists in this Platonic tripartite self model, his reason, which allows him to subdue and master these passions. A man who goes mad is like a ruler who was so weak that he was overthrown by his subjects. That's how they would have thought about it. And so this is why Foucault doesn't think their view on madness quite achieved the moral apogee that it reaches in the 19th century. Because even though they look to physiological causes of madness, it's not a strictly medical view, and it's certainly not psychological. They might have recommended that people with a weak constitution take iron. Why? Because iron is hard, and therefore strengthening. They might have sometimes made you labor on the farm like a beast of burden if you had gone, clinically insane. But what is the aim of either approach? One tries to make the afflicted person strong by a physiological cure. The other cure, it would be, I guess we could say, modifying their behavior. So one for the body, one for the soul. What's the common theme? Again, that madness can be corrected. Not cured, but corrected. It's corrected by work, or by discipline and brutalizing, or by physiological strengthening. Foucault quotes from François Leray here in his advice for how the doctor should treat the patient. Quote, "Do not employ consolations. They are useless. Have no recourse to reasoning. It does not persuade. Do not be sad with melancholics. Your sadness sustains theirs. Do not assume an air of gaiety with them. They are only hurt by it. What is required is a great sang-froid, and when necessary, severity. Let your reason be their rule of conduct. A single string will still vibrate in them, that of pain. Have courage enough to pluck it." End quote. This is why treatment of the insane at this time has a moral dimension, but it doesn't take on the same totalizing moral sense as it does later, because there is not so much a demand that the patient, say, take responsibility for his guilt and do the work from within in order to redeem themselves or something of that nature. That is a form of ethical authority that the doctor will take on later. The way the doctor operates in the classical age is by saying, well, this person is ill-constituted, dissolute, weak. We can discipline their body. We could discipline their mind, correct their error by means of external force, whether they like it or not. For Foucault, we should not make very much of the division between physical cures versus behavioral. Quote, "Only the use of punishment distinguished, in treating the mad, the medications of the body from those of the soul. Purely psychological medicine was made possible only when madness was alienated and guilt." End quote. One final passage from this section of the work that I think puts a really fine point on the distinction, the change between the Middle Ages and the classical period. Quote, "Medicine was now content to regulate and to punish, with means which had once served to exorcise sin, to dissipate error, and the restoration of madness to the world's obvious truth." End quote. Now, as we come to the end of the 18th century, the view on madness begins to change again. One of the major inciting incidents, as Foucault sees it, is the fear of contamination that arises in regard to the madman and to the madhouse. Foucault writes, quote, "People were in dread of a mysterious disease that spread, it was said, from the houses of confinement and would soon threaten the cities. They spoke of prison fevers. They evoked the wagons of criminals, men in chains who passed through the cities, leaving disease in their wake. Scurvy was thought to cause contagions. It was said that the air tainted by disease would corrupt the residential quarters, and the great image of medieval horror reappeared." End quote. Further, he continues, quote, "Many of these centers of confinement were built in the very places where the lepers had once been kept. It was as if, across the centuries, the new tenants had received the contagion." End quote. And people begin to look at the Hôpital Général as a potential source of infection. Foucault describes this as a kind of moral panic. In one incident, for example, quote, "In 1780, an epidemic spread through Paris. Its origin was attributed to the infection of the Hôpital Général. There was even talk of burning the buildings of the Bicêtre." End quote. While this epidemic was surely real and the inmates at Hôpital General were found to be suffering from a putrid fever that they attributed to poor air quality, the commission appointed by the police to investigate the claims that the disease originated in the Hôpital concluded otherwise. They said that the symptoms observed were, quote, in accordance with the nature of the season and exactly the same as the illnesses observed in Paris at the same period, end quote. But the rumors persisted in spite of the government's findings. And so this fear of madness is experienced as a fear of literal contagion, fever, respiratory illnesses, and so on. It's no longer just an error of one person's reason or one person's failure, a weakness of their constitution. The people begin to see the prison itself as a disgusting place, and the people want it moved farther away. Perhaps this externalized fear of contagion is part of a fear of that error, of criminality and madness itself, and a fear that it could possibly spread somehow. Perhaps it's a manifestation of that intuition that the prison, far from being an actual penitentiary, that is, a place where you are made penitent, is in practice a kind of petri dish of criminality. This kind of critique shouldn't be too unfamiliar to us. Many people make this argument today. I mean, what is a prison other than college for criminals? And Foucault cites a writer from the 18th century who says as much. He says of those who are released from prison that, quote, they return from this obscure, forbidden place, covered over with their own and others' debaucheries, lost to shame, and ready to commit all sorts of crime, end quote. La Rochefoucauld-Liancourt also complained of this, writing that when they visited the correction ward, there were 47 girls. And he says most of them were thoughtless rather than truly guilty. And yet they'd been interred with older women who were hardened by a life of criminality, quote, who can teach them only the art of the most unbridled corruption, end quote. But this conception does not just apply to criminality, it applies to madness. And Foucault notes that the early arguments for dividing the madman from the rest of the criminals followed this line of reasoning. Quote, when the prior of Senlis asked that madmen be separated from certain convicts, what were his arguments? Quote, he is deserving of mercy, as well as 2 or 3 others who would be better off in some citadel because of the company of 6 others who are mad and who torment them day and night, end quote. Foucault also quotes La Rochefoucauld-Liancourt again. He writes, quote, one of the punishments inflicted upon the epileptics and upon other patients of the wards, even upon the deserving poor, is to place them among the mad, end quote. And there is a common trope in psychological horror that you're probably familiar with, that I think Foucault comes right up to talking about, but he doesn't really make as much of it as I would. That by placing someone who is not insane with a bunch of people who are, one runs the risk of making them insane too. That if you're locked in a prison with a bunch of people who are screaming and doing strange things and saying things that make no sense, and these are the people you're interacting with every day, maybe their madness would rub off on you. Just like criminality might rub off on you. Maybe you could catch it. In the views of the time, one is a kind of moral weakness, the other is a kind of mental weakness. But this label of contagion changes things. That would seem to lead us to the conclusion that this should be treated as a medical issue. And so this is part of the great fear of the era that drives this reinterpretation of what madness is. To explain this change, we have to consider the way in which madness began to be treated as a humanitarian problem. Central to this story are the celebrated figures of William Tuke in Britain, who founds his Retreat for the Insane in 1792, and Philippe Pinel in France, who took over the Salpêtrière in 1794. Pinel and Tuke both pioneered a kinder approach to treating mental illness. In fact, their arrival coincides with the very revelation that madness is an illness, a purely medical condition. At least, that's how the story is usually told. For Foucault, the reality is very different. Now, I must say, it's difficult for me to make the case, as Foucault does, that there was no significant humanitarian or philanthropic motive. That, these were the first people to stop putting the insane in chains and treating them like animals and so on. But one of the innovations of Tuke and other reformers was the decision to separate the madmen from the general population of indigents and criminals. Now, obviously, even in the days of the workhouse, the madmen were often treated differently and sort of segregated from the rest of the general population, at least somewhat. I mean, usually they were placed on the lowest floors
And Foucault describes it as almost being like a dungeon, where they would be sleeping on straw bedding, attacked by rats in the night, and so on and so forth. William Tuke's Sanctuary for the Insane, however, is not a prison at all. It is described as more akin to a country farmhouse, surrounded by a walled garden. There are no barred windows, no irons and stakes and chains of the kind that the Hôpital Général was empowered to use. But an interesting question to raise about this change is, were they separating the madmen from the horror of the prison, or separating the prisoners from the horror of being interred with madmen? Because before Tuke and Pinel came along and raged against the inhumane treatment of the insane, arguing that they needed to be separated from the criminal element, that they didn't deserve to be interred with, the common arguments were the ones we mentioned before. The criminals don't deserve to be interred with the insane. Quote, "The presence of the mad appears as an injustice, but for others." End quote. This coincides with the move to stop imprisoning the idle and the indigent. This is another economic development. French officials such as Mirabeau noted that many of the people incarcerated simply didn't need to be there. Mirabeau says these people could be given some productive work to do. Perhaps the indigents could be forced into a trade that was perhaps dangerous or undignified that voluntary workers wouldn't choose to do. But they don't need to be incarcerated. As we mentioned, the workhouses had pretty much failed as an economic model at this point, so without that moral dimension of labor as a holy thing, a view which had waned during the Enlightenment, there was simply no sense in confining people this way. We might say that this is a natural development as we transition to the days of the Industrial Revolution. The old medieval views on work finally begin to die. Poverty became interpreted as an economic phenomenon, and not a moral one. And so that is why, at the dawn of the 19th century, we have the birth of the asylum. In this new model, insanity is distinguished fully from idleness and from criminality. The madman is separated from society, so his shame can be covered over and not scandalize others or drive other innocent people mad by their very presence. And what comes with this fully medicalized understanding is the notion that the madman should be treated humanely. But Foucault's insight here is that this does not end the cycle of expulsion, confinement, alienation. Further, this innovation does not change the fact that the control or correction of madness always occurs within a structure of power. Rather, perhaps counterintuitively from our perspective, the medicalization of madness occurs at precisely the moment when morality and guilt become definitive of our understanding of it. The medicalization of madness is the moralization of madness. In this new regime, the doctor becomes a kind of wise man. Foucault uses the term thaumaturge multiple times to describe him. This is a term for a magician, but more properly for the miracle worker, a person who is somehow magical, not by learning arcane secrets, but simply by their very being. Quote, "This is an essential point. The doctor's intervention is not made by virtue of a medical skill or power that he possesses in himself, and that would be justified by a body of objective knowledge. It is not as a scientist that Homo medicus had authority in the asylum, but as a wise man. If the medical profession is required, it is as a juridical and moral guarantee, not in the name of science. A man of great probity, of utter virtue and scruple, who had had long experience in the asylum, would do as well." End quote. And Foucault describes how the first doctor appointed at the retreat had no special knowledge of mental illness, that, quote, "he tried the various remedies that his own common sense and the experience of his predecessors suggested. But he was soon disappointed, not because the results were bad or that the number of cures was minimal." End quote. He then quotes, Foucault quotes Tuke here, quote, "Yet the medical means were so imperfectly connected with the progress of recovery that he could not avoid suspecting them to be rather concomitants than causes." End quote. So we have the admission from Tuke himself. What is the actual role of the doctor in the new asylum if he's not a medical professional applying special knowledge? I mean, remember, even those who were experts in madness at this time were not experts in mental illness. This was a new understanding of what madness was. There were no experts. To Foucault, the actual role of the doctor in the asylum is to be a kind of moral center, a pseudo-patriarchal figure. The retreat is the establishment of a familial power dynamic in which the doctor is the stern authority. He does not exercise his power by actually putting the disobedient child in chains. That would be inhumane. He just has to raise his voice and say, "Don't make me discipline you," or "Are you going to continue to misbehave?" And the threat of force will do all of the work for him. This is the great change in method that occurs around this time. It's interesting to consider yet again the way in which the old beliefs don't entirely disappear, they become transformed. So the use of work returns. The inmates at the retreat are given jobs. But work has a different sense now. It appears as part of the cure because the goal is to eventually reintegrate the mad person back into society, not because work is good in and of itself or something like that. The use of fear also returns. This is the same method that is used during the era of disciplining and brutalizing the patient. But again, the method is used with a different sense. Fear is a central tool in the doctor's arsenal, but it's not imposed by the forceful physical means such as beatings or chains. Foucault describes this at length in a following passage where he gives an example. Quote, Tuke tells how he received at the retreat a maniac, young and prodigiously strong, whose seizures caused panic in those around him and even among his guards. When he entered the retreat, he was loaded with chains. He wore handcuffs. His clothes were attached by ropes. He had no sooner arrived than all his shackles were removed, and he was permitted to dine with the keepers. His agitation immediately ceased. Quote, his attention appeared to be arrested by the new situation. End quote. He was taken to his room. The keeper explained that the entire house was organized in terms of the greatest liberty and the greatest comfort for all, and that he would not be subject to any constraints so long as he did nothing against the rules of the house or the general principles of human morality. For his part, the keeper declared that he had no desire to use the means of coercion at his disposal. Quote, the maniac was sensible of the kindness of his treatment. He promised to restrain himself. He sometimes still raged, shouted, and frightened his companions. The keeper reminded him of the threats and promises of the first day. If he did not control himself, it would be necessary to go back to the old ways. The patient's agitation would increase for a while and then rapidly decline. At the end of 4 months, he left the retreat entirely cured. End quote. So there is an interesting dynamic here in which the threat of force is not absent. The use of fear and coercion is still a part of the treatment of the insane. Because when one makes the statement that you'll be allowed freedom and dignity under the new way, unless, you break the rules, in which case we go back to the old way, the force of that statement entirely depends on what? The threat of the old way. Simply to invoke the old way is a threat. It's a kind of, the new way is just a sublimation of the old way. We don't put you in chains, we use the threat of chains to get you to restrain yourself. And this internalization of the power dynamic is a central part of Foucault's entire work. His later idea of the panopticon is precisely this, that the most effective form of surveillance is to get people to watch themselves. If people don't know when they're being watched, but they could be being watched at any time, they'll adjust their own behavior. And here, even if you've never been restrained by chains, but you know the chains are waiting for you if you misbehave, then you'll restrain yourself. And so Foucault writes, quote, we must therefore reevaluate the meanings assigned to Tuke's work. Liberation of the insane, abolition of constraint, constitution of a human milieu. These are only justifications. The real operations were different. In fact, Tuke created an assignment where he substituted for the free terror of madness the stifling anguish of responsibility. Fear no longer reigned on the other side of the prison gates. It now raged under the seals of conscience. Tuke now transferred the age-old terrors in which the insane had been trapped to the very heart of madness. The asylum no longer punished the madman's guilt, it is true, but it did more. It organized that guilt. It organized it for the madman as a consciousness of himself, and as a non-reciprocal relation to the keeper. It organized it from the man of reason as an awareness of the other, a therapeutic intervention in the madman's existence. End quote. The moral function of the asylum comes out most strongly in the ways in which the retreat serves as a kind of training scenario for the patient to eventually rejoin the civilized world, by proving that he can act according to all the expected social and moral conventions demanded by civilization. An example of this, which I think is actually kind of funny in a way because of the mental image that it conjures, are the tea parties held at Tuke's retreat. Foucault describes them here, quote, there were social occasions in the English manner, where everyone was obliged to imitate all the formal requirements of social existence.
Nothing else circulated except the observation that would spy out any incongruity, any disorder, any awkwardness where madness might betray itself. The directors and staff of the retreat thus regularly invited several patients to, quote, tea parties. The guests, quote, dress in their best clothes and vie with each other in politeness and propriety. The best fare is provided, and the visitors are treated with all the attention of strangers. The evening generally passes with the greatest harmony and enjoyment. It rarely happens that any unpleasant circumstance occurs. The patients control, to a wonderful degree, their different propensities, and the scene is at once curious and affectingly gratifying. End quote. This is such a strange idea in a way, and it may once again appear humane from a superficial standpoint. But Foucault notes, these interactions at the tea party are not genuine. The patients are not really conversing. They're not really getting to know one another. They're not really being themselves. They're being watched the whole time for any irregularity in their behavior. So they're not being trained to be social in the sense of actually connecting with human beings, but in the sense of acting the right way, based on what a judgmental observer might think. They're being taught not to be themselves if they want to maintain their privileges. And that turn, even though it sounds mundane, really and simply encapsulates the turn and how discipline is achieved at the asylum under Tuke and Pinel. The inmate is extended dignity and liberty as privileges, and punishment is a loss of one's privileges. So the structure of authority is still there, but it's just not reified by physical force. It's reified by getting the inmate to internalize the power structure. And that is what it means in the modern sense to be sane, isn't it? To have internalized the rules and regulations that civilization demands, and, regardless of what is going on inside of you, to act in accord with those rules. Now, there are differences between the approach of Pinel and the approach of Tuke. For one, the religious dimension. Tuke is a Quaker, and that religious background colors his approach to running the retreat. For Pinel, there is no religious dimension. In fact, Pinel perceives how religion can sometimes even be the source, or at least the proximal cause of someone's madness. Exploring these differences is somewhat interesting, but in the interest of time, we're not going to go much further than that in discussing those differences. There's just so much material in this book, so if you're interested in looking into any of this further, go pick it up and read it. But the important similarity between the two, for Foucault, is the way in which both place the doctor as this beneficent, thaumaturgic father figure. A man with no special medical knowledge, only a moral conviction, which leads him to treat the insane more humanely, but also to demand that the insane become more moral, that they understand their guilt and understand their own illness as their own responsibility to regulate. If the doctor tells you, behave yourself or we go back to the old ways, and then you have a manic episode, when you later reflect on that incident, you're liable to think, oh no, I screwed this up. It was my fault. When they put me in chains again, I did that. I'm responsible for my own punishment. The methods of authority, punishment, regulation, etc., are internal, and the subject is always interrogated as to why they have caused their own madness. Obviously, the asylum has changed since that time, and our own views of madness have also evolved. It might be interesting to consider Foucault's history in light of the closing of many of the state hospitals in recent decades in the United States and the effect that that has had. Probably the main development after the 19th century would be psychoanalysis, the revolution of Freud and his students. But Foucault argues that yet again, this development is both a transformation and a repetition. The doctor as psychoanalyst remains an alienating figure. Freud, in Foucault's view, simply transferred the medical power structure as established by Pinel and Tuke in the asylum within the system of confinement to a doctor-patient relationship in which the right of judgment as to what sanity is remains firmly in the hands of the doctor. And once again, there is an implicit threat there, in that if you say the wrong things to your psychoanalyst, maybe he could have you committed. If you admit you have the thought of hurting yourself or others, the psychiatrist, the psychoanalyst, still has the power of the asylum at his disposal. So it's another non-reciprocal relationship, one in which the doctor watches the patient, takes note on their utterances, their behavior, and renders judgment. Foucault writes, quote, "It is perhaps because it did not suppress this ultimate structure, and because it referred all the others to it, that psychoanalysis had not been able, will not be able, to hear the voices of unreason, nor to decipher in themselves the sign of the madman. Psychoanalysis can unravel some of the forms of madness. It remains a stranger to the sovereign enterprise of unreason. it can neither liberate nor transcribe, nor most certainly explain what is essential in this enterprise." End quote. And so, to this day, true understanding of madness remains unattainable. We still persist in the alienation of the insane, and it is still according to the dominant structures of authority by which the insane are perceived. What we understand to be the liberation of the insane that occurred at the dawn of the 19th century was, in fact, a, quote, gigantic moral imprisonment, end quote. Again, there's so much more to this book, but I think we have to call it here. I think we've gotten across the main thrust of Foucault's critique, his history of madness. Rather than a linear progression towards enlightened humanism, what Foucault sees is a series of perspectives, of frames, that are established according to political, economic, and social factors. At many times, what motivates us in dealing with the insane is not so much a desire to understand them, or the well-being of the insane, but a desire to hide them, to keep the rest of us safe from them, or prevent their madness from becoming a scandal, or to force them to accord with our moral world order. Our judgment on their insanity is always carried out according not to universal and eternal principles, but to the conventions of the time, such that Tuke was able to believe that he was helping the insane by getting them to act like the perfect picture of a polite guest at a tea party. And I do want to make actually one final remark, very briefly, to draw a comparison that I think will be very helpful to think about. I think this episode is a nice counterweight to Jung's undiscovered self in the episode we did on that. This book and Jung's essay are both products of mid-century psychology on the European continent, and they express radically different views, incompatible views. For Jung, constitutional government is objectively the rule of reason, the society inherited from the Enlightenment, and madness is like an infection, and it can't be allowed to spread. It is like a latent chaos waiting to burst beneath the stratum of orderly thought. What would Foucault say about that? I mean, he would probably say Jung is simply recapitulating to the old fears about mental illness as a source of contagion. And furthermore, Jung sees insanity as part and parcel with a kind of moral failing, the inability to take command of oneself through, whether it be religion, self-knowledge, whatever we might call it. And he links mass insanity to the crimes of the Nazis and the Soviet Union. So Jung is making unreason the domain of the worst, most incomprehensible acts of cruelty and genocide, the most morally repugnant actions. These belong, for Jung, in the category of insanity. And so it's a kind of moral imperative to keep ourselves sane. Once again, in our modern thought, the old structures of authority return, a little bit different, but also a repetition. I think that's what Foucault would have to say about Jung. Perhaps we might think of another great French writer, Jean-Baptiste Alphonse Karr, and his famous quote, "The more things change, the more they stay the same." Perhaps we can understand the contrast between Jung and Foucault by doing what any good postmodernist would do, and by looking to the underlying political motivations of each of these two authors. Jung wishes to preserve liberal democratic rule. Foucault wishes to disrupt the authoritarian tendencies that he sees as still contained within that rule. I'll leave it to all of you as to which of the two of them has the better argument, or whether the way forward is perhaps to give both of them a voice, acknowledge the truth in the views of both, and let yourself sit with the tension. Other than that, I have nothing else to say this week. I feel like I talked for a long time and still maybe got through half of the really important concepts in Madness and Civilization, because there's so much, it's all over the place. It's so heavy with sources and citations. It's worth giving it a read yourself. Although, as I warned at the beginning, it's tough at times, but I think it's worth it. He also makes a number of comments about Nietzsche and the final sort of reflections that I didn't get to, which I had originally planned on talking about, but it's almost, those remarks were almost less interesting to me than his History of Madness, so I decided to leave it to one side. In any case, thanks for joining me, everyone. We'll be back next week, going back to ancient Greece again, with a story about madness. A story about madness rippling through the whole city of Thebes, coming in the form of a god of ritual madness. It's the Bacchae by Euripides. Join me then. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche Podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.